All right, Israel is heading for yet another national election. It's fourth in 2 years after the country's parliament was unable to pass an annual budget by Wednesday's midnight deadline. You'll remember Israel is very fractured politically. The country currently has two leaders, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his partner Benny Gantz. Both men are blaming one another for the latest government collapse. Now, for more, let's bring in Dan Raviv. Dan is a columnist at Newsday and former CBS News correspondent. He's also the author of Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars. Dan, thank you for joining us. What does it mean for Israel's government to collapse? What led to it? And what happens next?
Well, they have a different government system over there. It's a parliamentary system, and they have a rule that if the parliament or Knesset fails to pass a national budget, then it means that the government and the coalition, and in fact the whole parliament, failed, and so they have to dissolve the Knesset. That's what the deadline means. You dissolve the parliament, automatically that means there will be new elections. They're set now for March 23rd. That'll be the fourth set of elections in just 2 years because those two leading politicians, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, a retired military chief of staff, they were rivals in the first three rounds. Then they formed a coalition together. But it turns out that they have not been getting along. They could not agree on a budget. That's why we'll have an election in 3 months. But you know what? Netanyahu is definitely running again. He's been prime minister for 12 years in Israel. But Gantz, his party, it actually has shrunk so much. It looks like there will be a different rival to Netanyahu, a man named Gideon Sa'ar, who has just left Netanyahu's party. So everything over there is in turmoil right now, Tom.
That's fascinating. Well, explain why Israel currently has two prime ministers and what that means for Benjamin Netanyahu's future.
When they made the coalition deal this past spring, Netanyahu agreed to step down in November of 2021. That would have been a really big deal. It's called a rotation. So Benny Gantz, the alternative prime minister, that was his title, would take over as PM this coming November. Now, there always were a lot of suspicions among the critics of Netanyahu, and there are many in Israel who didn't believe that he would step down. And you know what? That whole deal is now canceled. Instead, you'll have the elections. Gantz, by joining the coalition, apparently ruined his reputation. And so there's a chance that Netanyahu and his Likud party will again win, and come back into full power and have 5 years in office. On the other hand, in Israel, you usually have to form a coalition with somebody, and we'll see how that new rival, Gideon Sa'ar, does.
Israel has been in gridlock for a very long time, to say the least. Israel's previous three elections have resulted with no party gaining a majority in parliament. Now, if history is any indicator, does it look like that will happen again in the spring?
Yeah, they have 120 members of their Knesset, of the parliament. You need 61 for a majority. Nobody gets 61 for decades. Always some sort of coalition has to be formed. And if you watch the Middle East, you wonder whether it'll be left-wing liberal on all sorts of things, civil rights, economics, also on a willingness to pull out of the West Bank, which Israel captured back in 1967, and whether to negotiate with Palestinians. Netanyahu has had a mostly right-wing coalition that's very stubborn toward the Palestinians, and President Trump has supported that. He cut off money to the Palestinians. Also, Trump did Israel a lot of favors. Netanyahu, obviously a close friend of his. Trump made sure that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, would push some Arab countries to open peaceful relations with Israel. So in the past few months, it's been almost a miracle for Israel. Open, friendly relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Sudan, with Bahrain, with Morocco. Jared Kushner considers it a great accomplishment. You wonder again if it'll lead to peace in the Middle East. Will it help lead to negotiations with Palestinians or lock them out? Either way, Netanyahu has said thank you to Trump. But now Netanyahu, by the way, has congratulated Joe Biden on his victory, and Israel wants to be always America's best friend. That'll be part of Israel's election campaign, too, Tom.
Obviously, this is set to the backdrop of the coronavirus. This election will happen as the nation attempts to vaccinate the population against the coronavirus, where 382,000 Israelis have been infected and over 3,000 have died. What's the potential impact of a change in government on these vaccination efforts?
Now, Israel's a really small country, total population less than 10 million. So think about 3,100 deaths, country of 10 million, right? If the population was as big as America, you'd have to multiply that by like 33. You'd have 100,000 deaths. But of course, America has more than 3 times that many. You get my point. It's been tough on Israel. Israel feels isolated in many ways. It's been very hard on the economy with a lot of shutdowns. But the death rate hasn't been that bad. And this week, the Netanyahu government is crowing about the rate of vaccination. The vaccinations are being given. Netanyahu got his on television. And they say that it could well be that all of the frontline medical workers and everyone over age 60 could be vaccinated within 3 weeks. They have a very organized program over there. And if that's part of the campaign, Netanyahu will claim that he's handled COVID very well. Tom.
We will be watching to see what unfolds in March. Dan Raviv, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.